Welcome to episode 71 of Communicast, a communication skills podcast. I'm Scott D'Amico, president of Communispond, a global communication skills training organization. Do you have a tolerance for ambiguity? In this episode, my guest, Paula Caligiuri, talks about this tolerance and how it can help you improve your communication skills. Paula is a distinguished professor at Northeastern University and co-founder and CEO of Skiilify, which focuses on cultural agility. Join us as we discuss the connection between asking questions and innovation, the benefits of being patient, and why you should ask for feedback. I hope you enjoy. Paula, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Scott. Happy to be here.
Perfect. Really looking forward to our conversation. And before we get too far into it, why don't you maybe take a moment, tell the listeners just a little bit about you, your career journey, and the exciting work that you're doing today.
Sure. So I'm actually a professor over at Northeastern University and also the co-founder and the CEO of a company called Skiilify. And really, my entire career has been dedicated to helping people work effectively in different countries and with people from different cultures. And cultures could be different generations, different backgrounds, professional backgrounds, whatever the dimension of culture could be. I'm helping people sort of work more comfortably with one another.
Fascinating. What led you to that line of work?
Yeah. Oh gosh, this goes back to the 80s. So in the late 80s, I was studying abroad and the market crashed in 1987. The money I had saved up, I was in Rome, went away. And then kind of in like, it seemed like overnight, mom and dad said, look, you have two choices. You can either get a job in Italy or come home. And I did not want to go home. So my experience in Italy at the time was one of, you know, basically I was working, I was going to school, but I was also staying in Rome where my other American friends were running around. Anyhow, fast forward, I returned back to finish up my degree in psychology, my undergraduate degree, and my psychology professors were saying, Paula, if you felt so changed as a function of living in another country, why don't you study it? And so really what had happened was I had had such a deep developmental experience because I really couldn't spend time with Americans, that it really did change who I was. So I went on to graduate school in 89 and finished a PhD in org psych around this topic of helping people live and work effectively in different countries and try to understand how they change from those experiences. So my career has been, I'm a little bit of a one-trick pony. I've been doing the same thing for many, many years now.
Well, how cool is that to be able to make a career and a life out of something, one that you seem to be truly passionate about, but then also something that really has had a profound impact on you. I think a lot of people don't get that or don't do what it takes. I don't want to say get it to make it sound like it just happened, but they don't do what it takes to be able to really truly make a career, make a living out of something that they're passionate about and that has truly impacted their life. So kudos to you for doing that and just the fascinating work that you're doing. As I think about this topic of cultural agility, to me seems one very fascinating and then also equally important in today's business world as we're so globally interconnected with businesses and at the same time thinking of the workforce of today. You mentioned cultural agility isn't just I'm from here, they're from there. It is, we now have a multi generational workforce. And if you think about that workforce, just how they interact and they work and they communicate differently. So I think this skill of being, having this cultural agility is really important in the workforce today.
Absolutely. So the big challenge I think for a lot of people is that we assume a cultural difference is exactly as you described, right? It's, what's your heritage or what country are you from, therefore you are, and it's not. It's really just how have you been socialized and what were all of those or who were all of those socializing agents in your life over time. It could have for most people it was their family. Could be faith, it could have been your faith community, it could have been your sports, it could have been your education, it could have been your work, your profession. Lots of things socialize us to have the values that we have. And then when we bump in, and generation, as you noted, is also
Mhm.
a big one. And then when we bump into someone who has had a different set of socializing agents, we just reflexively will see the same situation differently. It's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's not racist or sexist or xenophobic. It's just different. We're just different.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, we're all impacted in essence by the culmination of experiences and interactions that we've had throughout our life. Playing sports, not playing sports, being very much into reading, not being very much into reading, traveling a lot, not having the opportunity to travel, having to work from a young age and not. So all of these things, in addition to what people typically think of when they think of cultural differences, really, I think, kind of paint that whole picture of somebody. And as you mentioned, when you meet somebody that has had really polar opposite interactions and opportunities as you, I think it's just a great place where people can connect and learn.
Absolutely. And one of the most important things that we can do as a skill to learn in these multicultural settings is to very quickly identify something that we have in common. Anything, anything. It could be you're wearing the same wristwatch or carrying the same handbag, or you have the same iPhone, which is fairly easy nowadays. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's anything. Because as soon as we can trigger our brain into seeing similarity, we're more likely to give each other more of the freedom to be
Mm-hmm.
different around each other. So it's a really important skill.
Yeah, I love that thought that when you find similarities, it allows people to think somewhat feel different, which seems somewhat counterintuitive. But when you make that connection with somebody, the guards come down a little bit, they open up and feel free to share more of who they are.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to it's evolutionary. It's evolutionary biology. We are trained to be tribal. You know, we trust who we know, and we trust who seems like us and is familiar to us. So new is different. Different is bad from our brain's perspective, from our limbic perspective. But the second we can find something that feels familiar, again, it just changes our whole outlook on the person with whom we're interacting.
And I would think as you've been studying this field and really understanding this concept of cultural agility, communication is going to play a big part of that. How people can effectively communicate and understand the differences and bridge those gaps. And I'm sure throughout your travels and your studies and the work that you're doing, you've ran into some great communicators, perhaps some not so good communicators. But from your perspective, when you hear that somebody is a really strong communicator, or somebody says someone who has great communication skills, what's that mean to you? What's the picture that comes to mind?
Mm-hmm. So, as you noted, my work is mostly in the multicultural area. So when I hear and think of someone who's a great communicator, that individual is able to, they have this tolerance of ambiguity. They can linger longer in a new situation and really kind of listen, observe, and not rush to judgment. So it's like a fundamental part of communication is to understand the situation in which you're communicating. So they wait and they observe and they listen, and then they ask questions to better understand and to sort of verify that what they're sensing is accurate, because it might not be, and they're really good at realizing that they have a lens that might not be shared with the person with whom they're communicating. So those who do it really well get a great sense of the situation that they're in before they start kind of using a certain style, communicating with a certain style, or communicating in a certain way, or whatever. Yeah, they read and respond accurately.
The things that you hit on there, this idea of maybe just broadly call it somebody that's patient when it comes to being in a scenario. I think you said they're able to kind of wait in that ambiguity or be comfortable in that ambiguity. So they're patient, they're taking things in, they're listening, which is a key thing, which ultimately allows them to focus in on the audience and what's going to be important to that audience. And as you mentioned, as you do that, you start to know what maybe is motivating this person or what's driving them or what's important to them. It then helps you to frame your questions. So as I know what's important to somebody, it's going to change perhaps slightly the wording of how I ask a question or what questions I will ask of them. And then has to be the important part. You need to make sure you listen. If you're going to ask a great question, don't make the mistake of not actually listening to what somebody says, which unfortunately happens all too often. But you combine that patience with the observing, asking questions, and listening really leads to effective communication. And it's interesting, those skills there are very closely associated with creativity and innovation. So you think the people that are very creative, they're very innovative, those are learned skills. So people that can question, they observe, they network, they start to experiment a little bit, tend to be very, very much the innovators, the creative people. And if you think about kids, young kids tend to be really, really creative and really innovative because they haven't necessarily had all of these kind of cultural norms thrust upon them as much. And they're more open to asking questions. They're more open to interacting with people that are different. And that's why kids tend to be so creative, because they're asking, they're listening, they're observing, they're taking in everything and then processing it.
Yeah, for a child, everything's a new and novel setting, right? One of well, some among the top competencies of people who are deeply culturally agile are things like tolerance of ambiguity, but also curiosity that you're naming, and humility. So it's the ability to say, you know what? I know that this situation, or I know that this other person will have a different lens. And the last thing I can do is assume, or the last thing I should be doing is assuming I know what's in this individual's heart and mind. So there's that humility to say, you know what, I don't know what this context is. I need to
Mm-hmm.
understand it, and I need to. It doesn't diminish my skill set. It doesn't diminish my credentials. It doesn't diminish my technical skills. It just means I'm willing to take the time to learn the environment that I'm in and ask the right questions. And as you said, listen.
Yeah, that is a key part to all of it. Yeah, absolutely. The humility plays a big aspect, and really that curiosity. And I think not just asking for the sake of asking, because okay, I need to know this about somebody, but really truly people that are curious are the people that are the most, I think, fun and enjoyable to connect with and talk to. They really want to know about you, and you can feel that. You can feel when somebody is genuinely curious about something about your background or where you grew up or some of the your family traditions. When they're talking and asking you, they're like, okay, they're leaning into it versus just somewhat going through the motions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so many
Well,
people think they are curious because they, will stop and Google something. That's not curiosity. That's needing a piece of information at the moment that you need it. True curiosity is you're just in it for the sake of understanding.
and as you, Paula, think of the workplace today, and as organizations, as we touched on a little bit earlier, they're very much globally interconnected, both from where their employees are at. They have employees working all over the world, then also their customers. It could be a smaller company that is based in the United States, but they have customers all over the world. So they need to really understand, and I'll use the term very loosely, how to communicate with them, whether it is just internal communications or messaging going out for marketing or customer service. So as you think of the workplace today, what are some of the skills that employers really are either looking for or they're doing really well with developing in their employees to be culturally agile?
Yeah. So I know LinkedIn just did a study and found that the number one sort of skill, the most high demand skill, was adaptability. And I actually would take it a little bit further and say, based on the definition, I think what they're looking for is agility, not adaptability. So what we found is that this construct of cultural agility it is really three things. One of them is adaptability. It's going into a situation and comporting yourself as the other person's expecting you to be. So communicating in a way that they're expecting, acting in a way that they're expecting. Really important for sales, for marketing, and those types of professions. But there's two other ways, right? There's the we call cultural minimization. That's saying, you know what, you and I are different. We're seeing the world differently, but you know what, this one's non-negotiable. So it could be ethics, it could be corporate values, it could be situations of like operations or production schedules or quality control. We've got a lot of non-negotiables here. So the communication there is really the ability to sort of motivate, persuade, change the hearts and minds of others. And then there's this third way. It's called cultural integration, where it's saying, okay, look, I can see we see the world differently, but it's not going to be my way. It's not going to be your way. We're going to just stop and take the time in order to almost create a new set of norms that are unique to us or our work group or the unit that we're in. And that's going to take a little bit of time, but doing that front end work is going to make our team, our work group, our entity thrive. We're going to do really well in the long run. So, Scott, what I found is that really people who are great at this they know when to pull each of those three levers. They can go in, as we talked about before, they can go into a situation, read the sort of the needs of the environment, ask all those good questions with their great curiosity, spend a little more time lingering longer, having a little more patience in those situations of ambiguity, read the environment, but then they know, okay, now I know how to respond, and they pull one of those three levers. So to answer your question, I think companies that are fostering those three well are winning. They're doing really well in helping their folks be effective in a multicultural environment. Individuals who are learning how to do those three well are succeeding in a multicultural environment in ways that others cannot.
What are some ways that you're seeing companies do this? The companies that are winning, or the individuals that are succeeding, that they really are building that agility. And I like the distinction between adaptability and agility. The adaptability, I think you can change to an environment. Agility, if I'm understanding, is I can very quickly know how and when to adjust those levers. But what are companies doing to really help people succeed in these areas?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You have to kind of go back to what makes people effective in this, and I don't want to get overly technical with it, but if you think about there's different competencies that lead into the ability to be culturally agile. And each of those competencies has a bit of a recipe. And if you think about, like, in any recipe, recipes have ingredients. The ingredients sound like things that are nurture and sound like things that are nature. So nature being our dispositional traits, the things we can't change, nurture being the training and development and the ability to learn some skills, right? So on the nature side, dispositional traits, personality, and the like, what we're seeing companies do is they're differentially attracting people into the company who have these competencies, things like tolerance to ambiguity, resilience, perspective taking, humility, and the like. They're finding them. They know that they're going to be tough to gain. Those skills are going to be tough to gain. So they're actually looking for people. So it's that whole, attraction and selection into the organization. Then once they're in the pipeline, they're doing the things that sort of step them up in ever increasing their skill building. So it could be, for instance, helping people begin with, some training. Could be training awareness of their own cultural values and then values of others. And then it could step up to, working on a multicultural team or a multi-professional team or multi-generational team, whatever that might be. And then it might be stepping up from there. And then it might be stepping up from there. Basically, they're leading people through the development of cultural agility. And that in combination seems to be working. Sorry, that was a really long answer to a short question, but it's the skills of who are you attracting to even apply to your company? Who are you selecting into your company? Hopefully you're differentially selecting for the things that aren't going to be easy to change. And then once they're in, then working on those things that can be trained and developed.
You bring up a fascinating point there, is that this idea of building cultural agility is not a one and done. Okay, we're going to run some training and now all of our people are going to be, culturally be able to adapt and be very agile with this. It's really that full life cycle of what's our employment brand? What are we putting out there, as you mentioned, to attract people to come to work at this organization? Then once you kind of go there, you have the employment, or quote, say maybe onboarding process, whether it's from screening and interviewing to getting people on board. And then once they're on into your organization, you have a solid foundation, you're growing and developing and continuing to progress that. So I think companies sometimes miss the mark on a number of areas when they just say, okay, well, we're just going to do some training for this and it's going to be done. And then they wonder why behaviors don't change and things aren't happening. It's this full spectrum of, from, the very beginning, before somebody even thinks about coming to your organization, to well beyond after they maybe move on to the next opportunity. What have you been doing and what are you doing to put out there to attract that talent in the first place?
It's funny when companies say, well, we really can't mess around with our, our selection, we have to select for certain skills, and those skills are hard to find, So then what we do is kind of do a, a deeper dive once people have joined the organization, sort of to differentiate who's going to have the, if you will, aptitude to build cultural agility relatively quickly. So if you take that, those new entrants into your organization, and then say, okay, among this group, who might gain this really quickly, and then move them toward those roles where it's really critical to have cultural agility, and then sort of differentially train and develop that group. So there's different ways that companies do it, but you're right, it is the full pipeline.
Paula, shifting gears somewhat a little bit, as you think of your career journey and the success that you've had, and as you mentioned, being able to really be somewhat laser focused on this topic throughout your career, what are some of the communication skills that have been an important part of that success and that longevity in your career? What are some things that you really have felt have contributed to really you being able to be successful in this area?
Right. We began this conversation with the story I mentioned about being a student of studying abroad in the 80s, and then what happened next. The part that was missing from the what happened next story is that I was working with those psychology professors, but it was because I took the time to ask for some feedback, and they took the time to sort of look into who I was as an individual and guide me along the way. So I would say the one thing that's been pivotal in my career is that at every major inflection point, I've just sought out the advice of those whose opinions I valued and trusted, and I was willing to ask for a lot of assistance along the way, and help. So when I work abroad, and I do spend a lot of time working abroad, it's often having to ask the question, how can I be successful here? Going back to that humility piece. And it is amazing how much I've learned just from asking a basic question. I'm not, lowering my skill set, just saying, hey, I'm just curious. I want to be effective as a consultant, or as a lecturer, or whatever. How can I be effective here? That's been probably the most useful tip
Mm-hmm.
that I've had in kind of reflecting on my own career. And then along the way is just having great role models, people who I can still point to and say, wow, they just did it really well. And I found myself emulating their style and their approach. That seemed to work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it definitely seems to have worked. And I love this concept of coachability. And one of my past guests talked a lot about coachability. That's really his area of expertise. And he talks a lot about how leaders fall into the trap of losing that coachability as their career progresses for a number of reasons: that I'm too busy for it, I don't need to worry about it, or I'm the boss. If I ask a question, if I ask for feedback, that might bring my stature down, or I just have a bunch of yes men, yes women around me that aren't willing to give me that type of feedback. I just surround myself with people that are going to constantly agree with me. So that's fantastic, just to have I think the humility and the vulnerability as you continue to go on to ask that question, how can I be successful here? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a little nuance to it, because everywhere you go and at every point of your career, those responses are likely going to be slightly to dramatically different based on where you're at in your development, and literally where you are at in the world is going to have an impact on those responses.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. It's a really good, simple technique that seems to work. I will say, gosh, this is a show about communications. I had one when I was in Finland that was just a great example of it. I was doing an executive program, and I was following a German professor who was speaking ahead of me. The audience was all Finnish, so the German professor was asking questions and people were answering, and it was fine. So I thought, oh, this is great. I can ask questions also. So I got up, and I was, doing the same thing, giving my talk and asking questions, and I was getting silence. So I'm like, something's up. You're like, oh, it's
Mm-hmm.
so like you can inflect this. So, okay, it must be me. It must be because I'm female. It could be because I'm American. It was none of those. I went to my host and I said about during the break, I said, just curious, I'm noticing this. How could I be better at, getting the group engagement? And she said, "Oh, Paula, when you're American, when you ask a question, Americans only all they need is like a little uptick in a voice to understand that it's a question. We're finished. We need like I'm asking you a question. We need something far more direct." And so the difference between you and the previous speaker was he had like the questions like on his slides to be answered. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that was such a simple, easy fix. And the
Mm-hmm.
second half went much better. And I said, okay, I'm asking a question.
So that's a perfect example of why asking questions is so powerful. Had you not been humble enough to ask that question, or perhaps didn't care, or just doubled down in the second half, you likely would have still been met with those crickets as you were asking questions. So it is whenever you can, whether it's you've read the audience, you've paid attention to the audience, you realize, okay, what I'm doing now isn't working. Something needs to change. You can just continue to throw spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, or you can ask questions. And typically that's going to be a lot more effective way at getting results is asking somebody that's in the know, some critical questions and then paying attention to their responses. I love that.
Absolutely.
You touched on this just a bit ago, Paul, about having some great role models throughout
Mm-hmm.
your career. Who is somebody that has really had a big impact on your communication style? Maybe you've taken something from them, tweaked it, made it your own, but who's somebody that really has influenced your style over the years?
Wow, there have been a few. My academic advisors have been incredibly pivotal for me in terms of sort of shaping how I communicate. The probably Rick Jacobs over at Penn State, he was my PhD advisor. His style was so easy. He was incredibly bright, is incredibly bright, but just had this very easy, accessible style that enabled people around him to feel comfortable asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I just realized that that's kind of the best way to adapt. Regardless of the position, you want to make sure that people feel really comfortable asking you questions, and that you can kind of be accessible enough to like ask questions back. It's an ease that kind of a graceful ease that makes those communications better.
A graceful ease. I like that. And it does, it makes a big difference, that approachability, so to speak, especially from, as I think of a leadership standpoint, and especially if you're a leader at a large organization. I remember in a prior career, I worked for a company, 10, 15,000 employees. And there were some of the senior and executive leaders that were just very approachable. You felt comfortable regardless of the position that you were in, whether you're in the headquarter cafeteria, on an elevator ride, asking them a question, just chatting and talking with them. They made you feel at ease, and you could tell that they were listening. Versus others, you would just never think of approaching this person, just from sometimes the tone that they used in their communication, sometimes honestly just the look on their face. You're like, nope, not talking to them today. But yeah, as you put that out there, that accessibility comes out and it opens the lines of communication. And I would say the companies that are winning, the companies that are being successful, they have very open lines of communication throughout their organization where, in essence, anyone feels comfortable talking to anyone else in that company. That's how things happen. That's what will accelerate ideas. What will accelerate fixes, and typically, bubble up problems and issues before they come major problems and issues, because people felt comfortable communicating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul, as we are wrapping up here, what piece of closing advice would you have for the folks listening to this in general around the importance of developing the skills that we talked about today?
Yeah, I think the best piece of advice is to continually put yourself into situations of novelty. Put yourself out there into situations that are new to you with people who are demographically different from you. Practice the skill of asking two more questions than you normally would in any situation because you want to raise your bar on curiosity. Practice the skill of asking how to be effective in a given context, just so you just kind of respect that the context matters for your communications. Practice the skill of getting into situations that make you a little bit nervous, because that's usually your place of ambiguity. And the more you do that, the more you practice it, the wider your comfort zone will be. So we just have to keep practicing these small skills, and eventually, the cultural agility will rise.
Spot on. This idea of practice is so important. You're never going to get better at any skill if you don't, one, practice, and I think also know how to practice or know what you should be practicing. So the things that you mentioned there, you're putting yourself into novel situations where it is new, something you haven't experienced before, asking a couple more questions, being in scenarios where you are slightly uncomfortable, being around folks that maybe are different than you. So those are all things that are very easy for people to practice. As you mentioned, it will just continue. They'll see growth in that cultural agility.
That's
Paula,
what we hope
thank you.
for.
Yes, absolutely. Paula, thank you so much for joining me today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Scott. My pleasure.
Take care. A special thanks again to my guest, Paula Caligiuri. Paula's point about having the humility to realize you may not know what someone else is thinking or feeling and not assuming is spot on. Being humble enough to say, I don't know, and trying to find an answer or common ground is a true differentiator. As we wrap up this episode, remember that the journey of improving your communication skills is ongoing. Make sure to stay connected with Communicast by subscribing so you can benefit from conversations with future guests. If you found value in today's episode, I'd be grateful for your support. Leaving a rating or review is a fantastic way to let us know the impact this show has had on you. Thanks, and have a great day.